On a foggy night, the world seemed to hold its breath, wrapped in an oppressive shroud of mist. The mansion loomed ahead, its jagged silhouette cutting into the starless sky. Its walls, weathered by time, were coated with moisture, shimmering faintly under the weak glow of a half-hidden moon. The fog swirled around it, dense and restless, as though alive with unspoken secrets. Trees flanked the gravel path, their barren branches swaying and groaning in the cold wind. The sharp crack of one branch snapping echoed through the night like a gunshot, making the figure on the path flinch. Each step forward felt heavier than the last. The gravel crunched beneath their boots, but the sound was muffled, swallowed by the dense fog. The air itself seemed to press against them, thick and heavy, making it hard to breathe. A sense of unease settled in their chest, growing with each reluctant step. The wind carried faint, whisper-street branches rustling, the distant crash of waves and something else. A sound they couldn't quite place, like footsteps in the distance, faint and uneven. They stopped mid-step, straining to listen, their heart thudding in their ears. But the sound was gone, replaced by an eerie silence that felt louder than noise. The figure's breath came in shallow gasps now, visible in the frigid air. Their instincts screamed at them to turn back, to abandon whatever had drawn them here. Yet their legs moved forward, as if compelled by an unseen force. The mansion's massive wooden doors came into view, one of them slightly ajar, swinging gently in the wind. The creak of the hinges seemed unnaturally loud, sending a shiver down their spine. And then it came a scream, piercing and raw, cutting through the silence like a blade. It wasn't just loud, it was visceral, filled with such raw terror that it made the air seem to vibrate. The figure froze, their breath catching in their throat as the scream echoed in their mind, wrapping around their chest like a vice. The sound stopped as abruptly as it had begun, leaving behind a void of silence, even more suffocating than before. They stood there, paralyzed, the hair on the back of their necks standing on end. Slowly, the oppressive stillness coaxed their legs into motion again, each step hesitant, trembling. The interior of the mansion greeted them with an unsettling mixture of grandeur and decay. Shadows cast by a single flickering candelabra on a long table danced erratically on the walls, creating the illusion of movement. The faint smell of damp wood and mildew filled the air, mingling with something coppery and sharp. From somewhere deeper in the mansion, a faint, dripping sound echoed slow, rhythmic, and unnervingly deliberate. The floorboards beneath their feet creaked with each step, as though announcing their presence to an unseen audience. At the foot of a grand staircase lay a body, crumpled and motionless. The figure hesitated, their breath quickening as they forced themselves closer. The victim's hand clutched a letter, the fingers stiff and pale, as though frozen mid-action. The paper was stained with blood, its edges frayed. The writing, though smudged, revealed chilling words. "This isn't the end." The victim's face was a mask of horror, their mouth frozen in a silent scream. Wide, lifeless eyes stared upward, not just reflecting fear, but something far worsen, overwhelming, soul-crushing terror. Beside the body lay a shattered pocket watch. Its cracked face gleamed faintly in the dim candlelight, and its hands, frozen in place, pointed to a precise moment, 11:45 p.m. A faint engraving on the back caught the light, revealing a name, one that felt disturbingly familiar, though the figure couldn't immediately place it. The combination of the blood-stained letter and the shattered watch sent a wave of unease through them, a gnawing sense that these weren't just clues, they were warnings. The shadows in the mansion seemed to stretch and shift, creeping closer as the candlelight flickered. The question hung heavy in the frigid air, a chilling whisper that refused to leave. What could have stopped the watch at exactly 11:45 p.m.? Detective Eliza Shaw rubbed her temples, staring up at the mansion that loomed ahead like a vengeful specter. The weight of exhaustion pressed against her skull, and every step she took on the gravel path seemed to pull her deeper into the shadows, as if the earth itself was reluctant to release her. The night felt thick, dense with something she couldn't name. The air stood unnaturally still, disturbed only by the faint whisper of the wind threading through the skeletal trees. The knot in her gut tightened with each step. The crunch of gravel beneath her boots echoed unnervingly in the dead silence, like the mansion was listening. Each step felt like an intrusion, like she was forcing herself into something that wanted no visitors. As she reached the front door, her fingers brushed the tarnished brass handle. A sudden, sharp creak broke the stillness, and she froze. Her breath caught. She spun around, scanning the fog-drenched grounds behind her, but there was nothing, just darkness. Her breath hitched in her throat, her pulse quickening. She shook her head, shaking off the unease. Get a grip. It's just the house playing tricks. She pushed the door open. Inside, the mansion exhaled a damp breath. The groan of settling wood and the faint odor of mildew and decaying earth struck her immediately. The oppressive air hung heavy, almost suffocating. Eliza's eyes quickly scanned the entryway, the splintered banister, the peeling wallpaper curling like dead skin, and the long shadows that stretched impossibly far into corners where the light dared not reach. Her breath caught when her gaze landed on the body at the base of the stairs, a man in his 40s, his face frozen in a silent scream, eyes wide with terror. Eliza crouched beside him, gloved fingers tracing the contours of his lifeless form. Her eyes were drawn to the blood-stained letter clenched in his hand. She carefully slipped it into an evidence bag, her professional focus overriding the tension coiling in her chest. The hollow silence pressed against her ears as she stood, studying the man's face's expression, one of sheer horror. What had he seen in his final moments? Her gaze landed on something Elsie cracked pocket watch beside him. The intricate engraving on its cover had been nearly worn away, but the hands were frozen at 11:45 p.m. Eliza's jaw tightened. She studied the watch, feeling a strange sense of unease creep over her. Time seemed to have stopped here. "Eliza!" A voice called from the hall. She stood quickly, her movements sharp as she turned to see a young officer, gesturing for her to follow. "Here is something you need to see upstairs," he said, his voice trembling slightly. Her boots thudded heavily against the staircase as she ascended. The sound of her footsteps seemed unnaturally loud in the silence, like the mansion was amplifying each step. The officer led her to a room at the end of the hall. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit space frozen in time. A faint glow from a single candle illuminated a cluttered desk. Papers were scattered across it in a haphazard fashion, their edges curling with age. Shadows danced erratically on the walls, casting long, unsettling shapes that seemed to twitch and sway. Eliza's skin prickled as she stepped closer to the desk, her eyes locking on a leather-bound diary at its center. Her fingers brushed the worn cover, a chill running down her spine. She opened it with slow, deliberate movements, the pages crumbling slightly under her touch. The faint scent of mildew rose as she read, her pulse quickening with every word. "I hear them at night, the whispers. They come from the walls." The footsteps stop outside my door. I can feel them watching. Eliza's stomach tightened. She gripped the diary tighter, her heartbeat quickening. She flipped to the next page, the writing now more frantic. "It's in the corridor. I saw its shadow move." Her pulse thudded in her ears as she read the final passage. "They won't stop until they have me." "Eliza," the officer's voice cut through her thoughts, barely above a whisper. She snapped her head up, her eyes locking on his pale face. His eyes were wide with fear. He pointed toward the far wall. It took a moment for her to spot it. A faint outline of a hidden door, its edges nearly seamless with the wood paneling. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Eliza's breath caught in her throat. "The locals call it the haunted corridor," the officer murmured, his voice trembling with fear. Eliza ignored him, her attention fixed on the door. Her hand hovered over the latch, and for a moment, everything in the room seemed to still. The air felt thick and charged with tension, and her throat tightened. Another faint creak sounded behind her. She spun around, but there was nothing, only the shadows deepening. "Eliza?" The officer's voice broke her trance, a thread of urgency in his tone. "We'll come back to it," she said, her voice steady despite the rising unease in her chest. She forced herself to step away. As she turned to leave, the candle on the desk flickered violently, casting jagged shadows across the room. For a brief moment, she thought she saw something movement, a figure in the corner of her eye. But when she looked again, the room was still. Her footsteps echoed down the hall, each sound swallowed by the mansion's oppressive silence. The weight of the diary's words, the victim's terrified expression, and the corridor's looming presence followed her like a shadow, growing heavier with each step. Just as she reached the staircase, a faint sound reached her ears, a low, guttural whisper that seemed to seep from the very walls. It sent a chill racing down her spine. She stopped dead in her tracks, her breath catching in her throat. She glanced over her shoulder. The hall was empty, but the feeling of being watched was unmistakable. Her hand tightened on the banister as she descended, thoughts racing. What was this place hiding, and what was it trying to keep her from discovering? At the bottom of the stairs, her gaze landed on the victim's pocket watch, still frozen at 11:45. A single thought consumed her as she stared at it. What had stopped the watch and why? Suspects, interrogation with Eliza. Eliza stepped into the dimly lit room, the air thick with unspoken words. The mansion loomed around her, its walls seeming to inch closer, suffocating the space. The suspects were already gathered, their eyes flicking nervously to her as she entered. There was something unsettling about the way they looked at her, some with guilt, others with defiance. Her instincts buzzed, pulling her focus to each of them. The room was small, but it felt like it was closing in with every passing second. Jameson. Jameson was slouched in the far corner, his face an unsettling mixture of grief and anger. His hands gripped the glass of water tightly, the faint tremble of his fingers betraying the calm he tried to project. Every now and then, his eyes darted to the door, as if he were waiting for someone or trying to escape. I can't believe it," he said, his voice breaking, his eyes fixated on his hands. "She was my sister, detective. My sister. I couldn't protect her. Not from whatever this is." Eliza studied him closely, her gaze unflinching. His voice cracked just enough, his tears welling up with the kind of precision that made her skin crawl. But there was something off about it, as though he had rehearsed the line too many times. The way he avoided looking at the body when it was first brought in, The way his jaw clenched when he thought no one was watching it all screamed of a man trying too hard to convince others of his innocence. Leaning forward slightly, Eliza's eyes bored into his. "Do you regret not protecting her, Jameson, or is there something else you are hiding?" He didn't flinch, but she saw his jaw tighten just a fraction more. "I've already told you everything," he muttered, the words slipping out colder than before, his gaze flicking briefly to the door, betraying his control. Lily. Lily sat stiffly in the chair, her hands tightly clasped in her lap. She was the picture of innocence, her pale face flushed with anxiety, but Eliza wasn't fooled. Her discomfort wasn't just because of the interrogation, it was something deeper, a nervous energy that made Eliza uneasy. "Lily." Eliza's voice softened, but there was a firmness beneath it. "Can you tell me what happened that night? Anything you remember?" Lily's lips parted, but no words came out. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for something escape, a way out. Then, just as Eliza thought she might speak, Lily's hand slid into her bag. A flash of a leather-bound journal caught Eliza's eye. Lily froze, her body stiffening, and with a swift motion, she pulled the journal back, clutching it to her chest like a shield. Eliza didn't miss a beat. "What's in the journal, Lily?" Lily's eyes widened, and she shifted uncomfortably in her seat, a crimson blush creeping up her neck. It's nothing. Just personal thoughts." "Personal thoughts." Eliza's voice was gentle but probing. Lily's voice trembled, and she almost choked on her words as she tried to defend it. "I've been through a lot, Detective. I needed somewhere to put all my feelings." But the way she reacted to the journal spoke volumes. Eliza could sense the desperation, the panic she was trying to suppress. Something wasn't right. The journal wasn't just filled with personal thoughts, it was a key to the mystery, and Lily was hiding something bigger. Nash. Nash was slouched against the far wall, arms crossed tightly over his chest, his stance defensive and almost dismissive. He wasn't just avoiding Eliza's gaze, he was avoiding the truth. His narrowed eyes studied her, but there was something calculating in them, something that told Eliza he was far more involved than he let on. "Detective Shaw." Nash grumbled when Eliza approached, his voice low, almost mocking. "You really think any of us had anything to do with it? Just because we were around doesn't mean we're guilty." Eliza studied him with a steady gaze. His words were sharp, but his body language was all wrong, his hands clenched at his sides, his jaw tight. There was more to his reluctance, and Eliza could almost feel him holding back a confession. "Why were you here, Nash?" Her voice was cold, a sharp edge to the question. "What is your connection to the mansion, to her?" Nash's shoulders stiffened, and for a moment his eyes flickered, a trace of hesitation in his movements. "I live next door, Detective. You think that makes me a suspect? I didn't even like the woman. I didn't know her. Hell, I barely ever saw her around." But Eliza didn't miss the way his hand twitched at his side when he said, "I didn't know her." The tremor in his voice was brief, but it was enough to make her wonder. Nash was hiding something, perhaps not a love for the woman, but something more dangerous. Dr. Collins. Dr. Collins was the odd one out. His calm demeanor was unnerving, like he had already figured out how this would play out. He sat with a confident stillness, as though the chaos swirling around him was of little consequence. The doctor's pristine appearance, his perfectly tailored suit and immaculate hair, felt out of place in the grim setting of the mansion. "Detective, I believe you are grasping at straws," he said smoothly, his voice a quiet but unyielding threat. The body's been found, and you already have a handful of suspects. What more do you need from me?" Eliza's gaze never wavered. "I need the truth, Dr. Collins, and if you know something about it, I'll find out." His lips curled into a slight smile, but there was no warmth behind it. "I think you misunderstand, Detective. I am just here to help with the investigation. That's my role, anything more, nothing less." But Eliza didn't trust him. Every word he spoke seemed carefully measured, a deliberate dance of misdirection. There was something off about the way he sidestepped every question, the way he leaned back as if everything were beneath him. She could feel the crack in his facade, the tension just beneath the surface. "Did you ever treat the victim?" she pressed. His eyes flickered for just a moment, and in that instant, Eliza knew. But it was gone almost as soon as it appeared. "No," he answered quickly. Too quickly. "Not at all." But the tension in his voice spoke volumes. There was more to Dr. Collins than met the eye, and Eliza was determined to find out what it was. The clue that ties them all together. As the suspects fidgeted, Eliza's gaze was drawn to the mantel above the fireplace. A small forgotten object caught her attention: pocket watch, weathered and worn, its brass surface scuffed from years of neglect. The chain was tangled, the watch frozen at exactly 11:45 p.m. The watch shouldn't have been there. It was too out of place, too important. The time, the inscription, everything about it, felt wrong. As Eliza stepped closer, her breath caught in her throat when she saw the engraving on the back. "To my dearest, forever bound." Who had left this here? Who had given it to the victim? As the weight of the question settled on her, she realized it wasn't just the time that mattered, it was the watch itself. And the more she stared at it, the more it seemed to connect them all. Every suspect, every hidden emotion. It was all tied to that simple object. Looking back at the suspects, Eliza could feel the shift in the room. The air had thickened with an unspoken understanding. They knew she was getting closer. And they weren't about to let her uncover what they had worked so hard to hide. The twists unfold. Eliza's footsteps echoed down the long corridor, each one growing louder, almost as if the mansion itself were alive, waiting. The temperature seemed to drop with every step she took, her breath now visible in the dim light. The silence was deafening, too oppressive. She couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something, was watching her, hidden just beyond the shadows. As she drew closer to the study, the place where she'd uncovered the first clue earlier that morning, the air felt thicker, weighed down by secrets. She had hoped to find answers here. Instead, it seemed though every turn only deepened the mystery. The mansion, was it hiding something? Something it desperately wanted to keep buried. First twist. The hidden letter. Eliza stopped in front of the massive oak desk, a familiar chill running up her spine. She had already sifted through the pile of papers, but now they seemed like scattered pieces of a larger, incomprehensible puzzle. The victim's journal, the pocket watch. The eerie whispers that had followed her from the moment she set foot in this place, it all felt like part of a game she was no longer in control of. Her fingers grazed the edges of the papers, her mind racing through every lead she had uncovered. Then, something caught her eye: a yellowed envelope tucked beneath a pile of bills. It was old. The wax seal was faded, the symbol barely visible but familiar. She had seen it before in the victim's diary. Her heart skipped a beat. The same letters, the same symbol. She ripped the envelope open with shaking hands. Inside was a single sheet of paper, hastily scrawled. I know what you've been doing. The truth is hidden in the walls. Find the key. Trust no one. They're all watching. Eliza's pulse quickened. The words were cryptic, but chilling. Whoever had written this had known something that was never meant to be found. She glanced around, unease creeping up her spine. Who could have left this here? Why hadn't anyone discovered it earlier? Second twist. The witness disappears. Before she could fully process the implications of the letter, her phone buzzed. The sudden sound broke through the tension like a lightning strike. It was Officer Jameson. Detective, we've got a problem. His voice was tight, strained. The witness, they're gone. Eliza's grip on the phone tightened. Gone? What do you mean gone? Just walked out. We checked the cameras, no sign of them leaving. One moment, they were there. The next vanished. Her heart raced. This was bad. Too bad. Witness was her only solid lead. Now, they were gone. She had to think fast. This was no longer just about finding the killer. Now, someone was playing a dangerous game with her. Third twist. The photo with the masked figure. Eliza took a deep breath, trying to steady the pounding in her chest. She had to stay focused. She turned back to the desk, her eyes scanning the papers in a frantic search for answers. That's when she saw into photograph. It was old, the edges curled and brittle. The victim, smiling, standing next to someone Eliza didn't recognize. But what made her blood run cold was the figure beside the victim. A manner, perhaps a woman. It was hard to tell whose face was obscured by a grotesque twisted mask. The mask seemed to leer back at her, as though it were alive, staring with hollow eyes. Why had the victim kept this? What did it mean, and why hadn't anyone thought to look here before? Her breath hitched. This wasn't just a photograph, it was a clue. But what was it trying to tell her? And who was the masked figure? The questions piled up, but the answers slipped further away. Fourth twist. The unsettling whisper. A sudden shift in the air made the hairs on the back of Eliza's neck stand up. It wasn't the temperature, it was something else, something intangible. The walls seemed to close in on her. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching, as if the very house had eyes. Then, just as she was about to turn down the hall, a faint whisper cut through the silence. Her breath caught. Eliza, Eliza, you're too late. Her heart stopped. The voice wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. It was clear, too clear. The words felt like a weight pressing down on her chest. Who was it? The victim? The killer? Or someone else? Someone even more dangerous? Her pulse quickened as her eyes scanned the room. There was no one. No one except the shadows that seemed to stretch further with every breath she took. Fifth twist. The clue in the wall. Eliza's head spun, thoughts colliding in a frantic whirl. The photo, the letter, the missing witness, it was all leading her somewhere. But where? And who could she trust? Her eyes shifted, landing on the wall behind the desk. There was something there, a faint crack, barely visible in the dim light. Her heart skipped a beat as she leaned closer. It was a seam, not just a crack. She pressed her hand against it, and to her shock, the wall shifted. The grinding noise of stone against stone echoed in the room, and a surge of adrenaline shot through her veins. Hidden in the wall was a small metal box. She opened it cautiously, her fingers trembling as she lifted the lid. Inside were old photographs, yellowed paper sand, a note. A single line, written in jagged handwriting. She wasn't the first, and she won't be the last. Eliza recoiled. The weight of the words hit her like a punch to the gut. What did it mean? Who else was involved? And how did all of this tie back to the mansion? Sixth twist. The masked figure returns. As Eliza stumbled backward, her mind reeling from the discovery, her phone buzzed again. A message from Officer Jameson. But before she could check it, a noise soft but sharp caught her attention. She spun toward the door. There, in the shadows, standing just beyond the edge of her vision, was a figure. A man, or maybe a woman. The same figure from the photograph. The one with Her breath caught in her throat. The masked figure was real, and they were here. The stakes are higher now. Eliza's heart raced as the walls seemed to close in on her. Each new clue added more weight to the case, but the answers only slipped further away. With every twist, she felt herself being drawn deeper into a web of secrets that threatened to consume everything she thought she knew. There was no turning back now. The mansion's secrets were beginning to unravel, and Eliza knew that whatever truth lay hidden here, it was going to cost her everything. The confession and final twist. Eliza's fingers trembled as she ran them over the edge of the hidden compartment, her heart pounding in her chest. She had found it Lily's secret. The dresser, with its smooth, time-worn wood, concealed a drawer so expertly tucked away that it seemed like part of the mansion itself. But it wasn't just the compartment's clever hiding place that struck Eliza. It was the weight of the discovery it promised. With each passing moment, the room felt smaller, the air denser. It was as if the very walls of the mansion were closing in, holding their breath, waiting for her to unravel the truth. Inside, the compartment contained more than just dusty letters. It held the remnants of a life, love hidden from the world. The letters were carefully folded, their ink faded with time, but the photographs. They were frozen moments in time, and yet the victim's expression shifted with a growing sense of unease. In the earliest ones, his smile was genuine, carefree. But with each passing year, the smiles faded, becoming strained, as if some quiet sorrow had begun to gnaw at him. The last few photos were particularly haunting his eyes. Once full of life, were now hollow and distant. Then, Eliza saw it. A photograph that chilled her to the bone. The victim standing outside the mansion, eyes wide with terror. A shadow lurked behind him, barely perceptible but unmistakable. Whoever had taken the photo hadn't done so by accident. They had been watching, waiting. As the weight of the photographs pressed down on her, Eliza's stomach twisted. This wasn't just about a murder anymore. This was something far darker, something that had been hidden for years. Lily's confession. The room had grown colder, the silence between them almost suffocating. Eliza turned, her eyes narrowing as Lily stood in the doorway, her figure pale and fragile. She hadn't made a sound when she entered, had barely moved. The tension between them crackled in the air, an electric charge that had been building since the very first time they'd met. Lily's gaze flickered toward the hidden compartment, her eyes betraying her nerves. She said nothing at first, her hands twisting the hem of her sweater nervously. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. You found it, didn't you?" Eliza's heart skipped a beat. "I did, and now I need answers, Lily. What was he to you, and why did he leave all of this?" Lily hesitated, her eyes darting to the photographs, the letter spaces of her life now laid bare. She took a step into the room, moving slowly, as though trapped in a nightmare she couldn't escape. Her shoulders slumped as she sank into the chair beside the desk, the weight of the truth finally catching up to her. Her voice, when it came, was fragile, as if the very words might break her. "I loved him," Lily whispered. "I loved him so much, but I wasn't enough." Her voice cracked, the rawness of her pain cutting through the silence. Eliza could see the emotional storm brewing beneath her calm exterior. "I thought, if I kept him close, if I kept these memories, I could hold on to him. But something changed. Something in the house, in him." She paused, a shudder running through her as she wiped away the tears that had begun to spill. "I never wanted him dead, but I did want him to stay, forever." Eliza's gaze sharpened, sensing something still unsaid. "What do you mean? You wanted him to stay?" Lily's face contorted with regret. The sorrow etched deeply into her features. "I wanted to trap him, keep him from leaving me. I didn't know what else to do. He kept pushing me away, but I couldn't bear the thought of losing him. And the house," it whispered to me, "told me what to do. I didn't realize it had gone too far until I saw his body." Eliza's breath hitched. There was something in her story that didn't add up. "You are telling me you killed him. Is that your confession, Lily?" Lily's head snapped up, her eyes wide with shock. "Number, I didn't kill him." She wiped her face, the tears still welling in her eyes. "But I know who did." Eliza's pulse quickened, her instincts on high alert. "Who? Tell me, Lily." Lily's voice came out in a rush, the words spilling from her like a dam breaking. "It was Nash. He's been helping me. He told me how to trap him. He's been here longer than anyone knew watching. He's the one who did it, Detective. He's the one who killed him." The final twist, a shocking betrayal. Eliza felt the weight of Lily's confession hanging heavily in the air, the room spinning as the pieces of the puzzle clicked together in a way she hadn't expected. But something in Lily's tone didn't sit right with her. Nash? It didn't make sense. She had trusted him more than anyone else in this case. He was the creepy neighbor, sure, but this was beyond belief. And yet, there was something about Lily's desperation, the way she looked at Eliza as though she were begging to be believed, that felt off. Her gaze flickered to the door, just as the faintest of footsteps echoed through the hallway, barely audible against the creaky floorboards, but enough to send a shiver down Eliza's spine. She knew immediately what it meant. Before she could react, the door swung open, revealing Nash. Eliza's heart skipped a beat. "Nash," she said, her voice steady but her mind racing. "What are you doing here?" He stepped into the room, his face unreadable, his posture relaxed as if he had every right to be there. The tension in the room thickened instantly, the air crackling with anticipation. Nash met her gaze with a calmness that unnerved her. "I was hoping I'd get here before she said too much," he said, his voice low but controlled, void of any panic. "But I see she's already spilled the beans." Eliza's mind raced, her thoughts tumbling over one another. You were involved?" The weight of the betrayal crashed into her, suffocating her chest. She had trusted him. She had believed him. And now, in the cruelest of ironies, he was the one who had orchestrated the whole damn thing. Lily's face fell. "Nash, no," she whispered, her voice barely audible, filled with disbelief. You didn't." Nash smiled, but it wasn't the smile of a man who had just won. It was cold, calculating. "Don't look at me like that. I wasn't going to let the truth get in the way of our plan, was I?" The room seemed to close in around Eliza, the walls pressing tighter with each revelation. Her breath quickened as the weight of the truth crashed down on her. Nash had been in on it all along. And now, as he stood before her, a chilling question hung in the air. Suspenseful ending. The lingering question. Nash took a step closer to Eliza, his eyes narrowing. "You know, Detective, it's not just Lily and me you should be worried about," he said, his voice a whisper of menace. "There are others, people who've been watching you too." His words slid into the room like poison, and Eliza felt a chill creep down her spine. "What do you mean?" Eliza asked, her voice barely a whisper. Before he could answer, a soft shuffle from the hallway made her freeze. Someone else was out there, someone she hadn't seen, hadn't heard until now. Nash gave a slight nod, as though signaling something unseen. "There are more in the shadows, Detective, and they've been waiting for you." Eliza's breath caught in her throat. Who else is still in the shadows? The question echoed in the room, unanswered, leaving the air thick with tension. It hung there like a promiser, a warning. The shadows of the mansion pressed in around her, and Eliza didn't know who or what was watching her next.